Well, hello there, and it's my privilege to just add my welcome to you as well. Great that you can be with us here for this anniversary, a live link for the Logos Hope. And I hope you enjoyed that short video. Now is the hour that we just looked at. And it's my privilege today to have the man with us that comes up a lot in that video, and that's the former CEO of OM Ships at the time of getting the Logos Hope into ministry, and that's Bernd Gülker. Bernd, welcome to you. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there's many people on this call right now that know you and Margaret and have worked with you or friends of yours, and I just thought I'd ask you right at the beginning, before we get into some of your perspectives on that particular season in OM Ships history, just tell us a little bit. It's been a number of years since you've left the leadership of OM Ships. What have you been doing in that time since you left OM?
Well, it's certainly been a few years since we left. We left in 2009, and at that time we moved to Berlin because I was invited to take the leadership of the German branch of what is Samaritan's Purse. It was then known by another name here. And for 9 to 10 years, I led that work. At the same time, became involved in much of what is happening in Berlin. So it was another worldwide ministry that we became involved in. And a couple of years ago, I ended my official involvement, and since then have been involved with some other ministries, advising them and being on their boards and helping them to grow as well. So we still have a full life, and we enjoy living in this part of the world. We just live outside of Berlin and enjoy all that Berlin has to offer and all that Brandenburg has to offer with many lakes and many bike paths.
Wow, great. Well, it must have been pretty emotional for you watching that clip. Now is the hour. I have to say the years have been kind to you, my friend. You're looking good. You're looking fit. You're looking well. And it's great that we can just have this time to have this chat. And I wanted to ask you just right at the beginning, really, just give us an insight. Take us back, probably, I guess, 2 decades now almost, to those first ideas, those first thoughts, the reality of at some point probably needing to replace one of the ships, Logos 2 as it was at that time. Just give us some ideas and some perspectives on how that was, the journey to actually begin to what would ultimately be getting the Logos Hope. Just give us some insights into that for a moment.
Well, thank you first of all for the opportunity to be able to share with you. And what I'm going to share is my personal story as it relates to Logos Hope. From my point of perspective, there was no special experience or supernatural revelation at the beginning of this story. It rather was a process of much prayer, reflection, and discussion. And this resulted in our vision being refocused and reshaped. And that actually was the beginning of the Logos Hope project. The context, as you may well imagine, was very different from the context we experience today. Then there were crowds, real crowds. For the past year and a half, 12 people in one place were considered a crowd. And I can imagine that some of you almost have forgotten what a real crowd looks like. That's why I personally think it's exciting that Logos Hope now is back into receiving visitors on board. During many years of our lineup involvement, we often were thrilled to see crowds of people visit the ship in our ports. But at the same time, often we heard people express their disappointments. Visitors had hoped for more. Many of them actually said, why can't we stay on board longer? And I'm sure that many of you who were in lineup can relate to that. In the early 80s, I was book floor manager on the Logos. We then jokingly talked about a visitor in an Indian port whose feet never touched the deck because it was carried along by the crowd. All those of you who worked in the book fair of one of the previous ships, I'm sure, can relate to that. An idea that was discussed in the 80s, by the way, was couldn't we extend the Logos, sort of put in another middle section in order to create more space. So there were all sorts of crazy ideas going on. In the late 80s and early 90s, when I was director of Doulos, we had record number of visitors to the book fair and to the ministry. And the funny thing is, we thought we would do well, and we did well. Logos 2 on the other side of the world experienced the same thing, but the reality was that despite great efforts on board by the teams, we often were not really well equipped to minister to the people in the ports that we visited because the crowds were so big. I'm sure all of you know many stories of individuals coming to the ships looking for answers in life. I remember an older Tongan bishop in Papua New Guinea who later talked to us and said, I came on board incognito, I'm an old man, nobody offered me a place to sit down. Well, the truth is, there was no place to sit down. And I'm sure many of you who served with the ships heard similar stories. Then after being director of Doulos, when I started assisting Dale and later became director of the ministry, we as a leadership team began a process of discussing what we believed the preferred future of the ship ministry should look like. We still recognize that the greatest advantage, and we saw that in the video clip, the greatest advantage of the ship ministry was that ships are mobile. They were capable of drawing up to 1 million or more than 1 million visitors per year. The ships, in that sense, were a go structure and are a go structure, and at the same time are a come structure. People coming because they want to see and experience. So you've got both. And for us, the question was, are we using the ministry opportunities that God has given us to the best we can? As part of this process, we commissioned an extensive research project worldwide. We wanted to find out answers to the question, is the ship ministry still a valid ministry today? This research was conducted by David Greenlee, who spent many months interviewing people, and he came back with extremely helpful and important insight. It highlighted the uniqueness of the ships as we knew it. People everywhere experienced the ships as a place where the Christian message became visible and real, and in many places the ships brought, as we saw in the video clip as well, brought unity and encouragement. And David's conclusion was, if the ship ministry didn't exist, it would have to be invented. But the research also showed the need for ongoing change in order to remain a valid ministry. Discussions and prayer of the leadership team led to a renewed conviction. And the conviction was that we needed to refocus on the initial conviction and reason for the existence of the ship. And that was demonstrating the love of God to every ship's visitor. At the same time, we realized that we needed to develop a plan for a suitable next ship. Our focus was to share God's love with everyone in 1 million, using the ships as a platform for communicating peace with God and man. That's how we termed it. There was a new awareness of 1 million visitors every year and so many missed opportunities. Nothing new, but it just was a renewed emphasis. With much prayer and courage, the discussion process of a couple of years merged into a clear mission, refocusing, retooling. Where would the funds come from? We had no idea. Where would the needed extra people come from? We didn't know. Within a couple of months, I presented this vision to the leadership group of OM Ships, the boards, the OM International Executive Committee, and the OM International Leaders Meetings. All of them agreed, approved, and backed the decision to go ahead. That motivated us to move forward by faith. It's amazing. Less than a month after the final decision was made, I received a phone call from a donor who was excited about the vision and the initiative. And he wanted me to come and see him. And he committed himself to give the first major gift to the replacement ship. When the funds finally arrived, it was the largest gift OM had received up to that point. For us, an unbelievable confirmation of a process that we felt God had led us on.
Wow. Ben, that's fascinating to hear that. Some people that are listening on this call may well know some of those details. For others, this is totally new information, but it's certainly super interesting to hear the backstory. You're, of course, somebody that's lived through a lot of this history, right from, as you were just saying, just the very seeds of these ideas that go back many, many decades, through ultimately to that joyous moment of identifying the Logos Hope as the vessel that God was leading us to, and then, of course, purchasing it, and then renovating it, and then launching it into ministry. Your experience has spanned that whole period of time. And I just wanted to ask you, Bernd, just as you look back, as you play the tape back in your mind of those years, what are for you some of the absolute highlights that just stick out in your minds? I know there are so many of them, obviously, but just tell us a few of them for a moment.
Well, first of all, I want to say that I don't want to start with specifics, but with a very general highlight. And I think the most general, biggest highlight was that looking back, we witnessed God at work. And we experienced that God invited us to join him in doing his work. For me, that was an incredible highlight to realize that. So many highlights, as you say, but I can only pick out a few specific ones. One was the OM leadership coming on board, and literally coming on board in Langkawi, when the doulos was in Langkawi and the ILM was in Langkawi, with a major reception there. That was a highlight. The coming together of a project team, quality people coming together with technical and administrative expertise and experience. We even needed a container outside the ship's office to accommodate all of them because we didn't have the space. Then the search for the right ship, that in itself was a major issue. I remember visiting the Logos 2 in the Caribbean, excuse me, and taking a walk with the then director, Otni Jensen. And we had just been appointed, I think the second time, to the Nerona. And I shared with Otni Jensen, who was from the Faroe Islands, that this was the case. And I told him that somehow in my heart, there was a story that wouldn't go away in my mind as well. It was the story of Jesus telling his disciples to go to the man in the city and say, "Untie that donkey, the Lord needs it." And Otni Jensen got very excited about it and wanted to communicate to the chairman of the Smyrna line, whom he knew personally. So the story of untying the donkey became part of at least my own aspect of looking at, what is God doing to us, because the donkey carried Jesus into the world, and we wanted the ship to carry Jesus into the world. Then I remember as one major highlight, the sunrise prayer meetings in Mosbach on the glider airfield up on top there. Sometimes we would just gather there and pray that God would lead us. It was unbelievable. Negotiating then later on with Smyrna Line was an experience in itself. I remember after the first bid that we did, we weren't accepted, and then they called us. And they called me on my mobile, and they said, we are here together as a board, and we want to offer the ship to you, and we want to know, do you want to buy the ship? It was just before a wedding. I had to attend a wedding. I think many of us were attending that wedding in Mosbach. And then I told them, well, I'm at a wedding, call in an hour again. And then we talked about it, and they wanted a firm word. And so I said, well, next Monday, we have a day of prayer, OM worldwide. All of the OM fields will join in, and we want to hear from God. Is this what God wants us to do? And at the end of the day, we can sign if we all agree. They pressed and said, do you want that ship? I said to them, yes, we want it, but certainly we're signing. We want to wait till Monday. Later, I heard that not everybody on the board there was a believer in Jesus, and it was the strangest business meeting I think they ever had in selling that ship. So that was a highlight. The provision of funds from unlikely sources and major donors coming on board, even last minute, it was unbelievable. Last but not least, the thousands and thousands of people who got involved, whether it's volunteers, whether it's donors, leaders, all of them stepped out in faith, and each individual had their own story to tell of how they experienced God in this entire phase. So many highlights, so many wonderful things. On a very personal level, I had the privilege of untying the donkey, of letting go of the last rope in Kürge when the Logos Hope sailed into ministry. That was special, especially since it started to some extent off with the story of the donkey.
Bernd, it's almost emotional just listening to you and just hearing these stories. And of course, I and many others on this call are probably just playing the tape back in our own minds of some of those experiences that we lived through together with you. When we think back on a project like the size of that project, I mean, for sure, there were not just highlights, but there were some difficult moments. I'm sure as well that for you personally as leading the organization at that time. I don't know why I want to dwell so much on those, but a question I did want to ask you is what sustained you through some of those really challenging, difficult moments in a project of that nature?
Well, you're asking me. If you were asking others, you would get other answers. But here's some of what I recall. It wasn't all plain sailing, by no means, very clearly. But there were times for me when it was so obvious that we saw God at work, providing and guiding. Others probably felt the pressure more, and for them it may have clouded that. But for me, that was something I saw. And for me, that vision of carrying Jesus into the world on that donkey, in many ways, I had always before me. For me, one of the greater difficulties, and I want to say that, at times was that I felt unable to bring great unity to the ministry and sufficiently focusing on the overall vision. That had to do with different expectations, which may not always have been clear. Yes, those were difficulties, but for me, in many ways, again and again, it was that clear calling, that clear conviction. We all had agreed, we all together within OM, the boards, donors, we all had said, yes, that's where we want to go. And we were sailing through a few storms, and yet we were going forward. Sometimes, and as I said, it wasn't always plain sailing, we were with our backs against the wall. I remember times when we had to pay the next installment for the work that was done in the shipyard, and we couldn't really see where the money was going to come from. And it wasn't just a couple tens of thousands, it was in the hundreds of thousands and even beyond that. And there was one instance that I remember when we were basically at rock bottom, and the next installment was less than 2 weeks away. I had to go out to Logos 2 in, I think at that time in the Canary Islands, and I was on a train to the airport, to Stuttgart. And on the train ride, I received a phone call from Daniel Che. Daniel Che was director of doulos, and he had met with somebody of Korean descent and had shared with him. And that person, unbelievably, had promised that he would give a huge amount of money, almost as much as the first donor had promised to give. So I took that phone call, immediately walked out of the carriage to be private. But when I came back, I was rejoicing. I sat down again, and all of a sudden a hand moves from the seat before me and handed me a piece of paper. On that piece of paper, it said, "I don't know your circumstances. I don't know what you're facing, but it is so absolutely clear to me that God is with you." And then it said a few more things. Just a couple of months ago, I rediscovered the little piece of paper, and I think I actually discarded it. But those were the moments and the situations where God, in his own sovereign way, I think brought encouragement that we needed at that time in many ways. Was it all plain sailing? No, by no means. But there was a conviction till the very end that God had allowed us to embark on a mission that would bring us closer to our goal of sharing God's love with everyone in a million.
So powerful to hear these things, Bernd. Wonderful, just incredible and very, very moving, as I said earlier. Now you're in a different position. I just got one final question for you. What is the, as you reflect back, even as you listen to yourself and the words that you're saying to us right now, what is some of the learning that you took away from that particular chapter, some of that particular season in your life?
Well, it's always interesting, isn't it? As Christians, we keep learning, and in responsibility, we keep learning. And even over the last 10, 12 years, when I've been involved in other ministry, there's been a learning process, and it somehow is all woven together, and I can't actually identify what I learned exactly during those days. But I often talk about the things that during my times of leadership I learned, and I often share these in seminars or consultancies or whatever. Let me just quickly mention 5 general points. I'm too far removed from the ship ministry to say, boy, I wish they would do this, would do that. That's not my place anyway. We rejoice in what God has done for us and where God has led us. But for me, I think then as now, one of the most important things, and that would be point number 1, is vision. It is my personal experience that a ministry needs a clear, unified vision. That means asking questions and finding out what is needed. And then, with much prayer and reflection, formulate a vision, communicate it, and follow it together. The second that has really been etched into my life has to do with expectations. I've been in touch with many Christian ministries, and many ministries sometimes find it hard to know how to deal with expectations. It's vitally important to clarify expectations and decide how to deal with them. Ask the question, are the expectations legitimate or are they not? I've often found that it is counterproductive if individual expectations publicly conflict with the agreed and communicated expectations of a ministry. And it's often here, at this very point, that unity fails. The third aspect that I've thought and talked a lot about is problems. We usually call the difference between the way things are and the way we believe they ought to be a problem. The label we give a problem depends on the way we see or imagine things, and compare it to situations that we can relate to. We go back to our past and say, oh yeah, it was similar then and there. This means that the problem that we perceive is primarily subjective and not objective. Often I've been asked to help solve a problem. But the truth is, and I could say much more about this, the truth is many of us prefer a problem, as somebody said, that we can't solve to a way forward we don't like. So that's the third, problems. The fourth that I've learned much about, and I think I've really grown a lot in as well over these last 10 years, is the whole area of accountability. Real accountability needs clarity, great clarity. And at times we shy away from that clarity. And I have shied away at times from that clarity. It's vital that also in Christian ministry, authority and responsibility go together. They're two sides of the same coin. Leaders need to clarify this for those accountable to them. Authority without the corresponding responsibility easily leads to abuse of power. Responsibility without the corresponding authority usually leads to powerlessness. We are accountable for the responsibility given to us, but the authority, the permission and ability to fulfill it has to go along with it. There are many other lessons I've learned, but the final one, point number 5, is all glory goes to God. In the end, it's not about what we accomplished, but whether our service has focused on increasing the glory of God here on earth. Jesus said in Luke 17, "So you also, when you have done everything you were told to do, should say, 'We are unworthy servants. We have only done our duty.'" And for me, that has been great to have that perspective. It's helped me through many difficult situations. It's helped me through many issues where I wondered, is this right? Is this wrong? And I hope I can go forward in that way. And again, thank you for being able to share.
Bernd, it's been wonderful to see you today, and I'm sure there'll be many chats coming through on Facebook and on YouTube of people that know and love you and Margaret, and just passing on their greetings to you, and we'll try and forward those to you. But thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today. We wish you the Lord's blessing, and hopefully we'll be able to meet up with you again at some point in the future. Have a good time, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks again, and God bless.